I'd like to make one point to start, which is, of course, Putin just invaded Ukraine large this past week, but he actually invaded Ukraine over 8 years ago. So this is merely an escalation. And we now are at a point, and I think both Pierre and Daniela made this clear in the course of their remarks, that the West is beginning to truly understand the Putin challenge. I've been working on this Putin challenge since I got the Atlantic Council almost 8 years ago. And it's really pretty simple. He is pursuing a provocative, revisionist foreign policy, a foreign policy that he actually kind of laid out in his famous or infamous Munich Security Conference speech in February of 2007. But he also made it crystal clear in a series of conferences, which he's known to host, the Valdai conferences, which are sort of like the Russian equivalent of the Munich Security Conference. And at two of them, he had posted on the boards behind him when he spoke the following phrase: new rules or no rules for international order, meaning directly challenging the international security architecture that emerged first after World War II and then reinforced and slightly changed at the end of the Cold War. And his goals are actually very simple and very clear. And amazingly, he laid them out for everyone to see during this latest crisis. He laid them out in those two interesting treaties, draft treaties that he sent to the United States and NATO in December, and in his striking, even bizarre speech last Monday, where he laid out his aims in Ukraine. Those aims are essentially to restore, if not fully Russian control, then major influence in the entire post-Soviet space, which happens to include 3 NATO allies, the Baltic states, as well as in the Warsaw Pact, which includes a whole bunch of other NATO allies. So he has been pursuing a sharp challenge to major American and European interests for over a decade, with his war on Georgia, his taking of Crimea in 2014. And one of the reasons he's been doing this is not just that these are his objectives, but he's gotten very little pushback, or until recently, very little pushback. He took Georgia, and there were tiny, tiny sanctions. Sarkozy, then president of France, established the procedure for the de-escalation. And of course, the Russians violated it to this day with no consequences. He took Crimea in 2014, and there were sanctions, but they were laughable, and they were also ignored, as the famous Siemens turbines going to Crimea demonstrated. Only after they began the Russian war, the covert war in Donbass, did we begin to respond with some seriousness. The Americans put down serious sanctions in July of 14. And by the way, the Donbass operation began in April. And the Europeans were kind of reluctant even then. Only after the shoot down of MH17, the civilian aircraft, did the Europeans go in with large sanctions. But still, that was very good. The first time Putin faced real consequences for his revisionist foreign policy. And of course, those sanctions on the EU part a result of really good coordination between the US and the EU, I might add, have been renewed every 6 months since, to some Russian surprise. But I would say there's still incomplete understanding in the West, both in Washington and in Western Europe, of the need to respond strongly to Putin was evident in the big lethal weapons debate in 2015, 2016. And full disclosure, I was one of the 8 authors of an Atlantic Council report that came out just before the Munich Security Conference in February 15 that argued strongly for sending, quote, defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine. Biden didn't do it because he didn't understand the stakes in Ukraine and Europe. He famously or infamously said that Russia was merely a regional power. And the Europeans wanted no part of it. Trump, to his credit, wound up sending javelins to Kyiv in late 2017. But the point is, that whole debate showed how we didn't really understand the danger. Policy under Biden. Biden took the White House as someone well-versed in our interest and policy towards Russia and Ukraine. He had a reputation as being tough on the Kremlin. And I thought our policy was going to become very good from day one, but I was wrong. The policy from the start of the Biden administration until about a month ago was actually conflicted. On the one hand, Biden and his team understood that allowing Moscow to dominate Ukraine would be a disaster for us. Good. So there was a need to respond. On the other hand, they had a fatuous policy objective of creating stable and predictable relations with Moscow, a phrase you heard all the time. And this was the Biden way of doing something which was considered laughable in Washington policy circles, to have a reset with Moscow. And of course, you all know, or at least most of you know, that Angela Stentz has written all about how administration after administration going back to Clinton sought this objective, and each time it failed. But the Biden team was heading in that direction. And so there was this tension between these two strains, you might say, of Biden foreign policy. We saw it in the spring of last year when Moscow did the dress rehearsal for its current new invasion of Ukraine, not first-time invasion of Ukraine. They massed about 100,000 troops, a little bit less, on Ukraine's border. And Biden's team responded immediately and strongly. Every senior national security official in the US government called their counterpart in Ukraine. General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called General Gerasimov, the head of the general staff in Moscow, to lay down some warnings. And Moscow, as we all know, sent its troops away from the borders in the spring. But at the same time that they had that strong and necessary response to the Kremlin intimidation, Jake Sullivan was on the phone with Patrushev to begin the process of having the Geneva summit. And while I am a firm believer in talking, the Russians interpreted that as a sign of weakness. And something happened after that, which demonstrates my point. Starting in late April last year, we had a string of cyber attacks in the United States, including a couple, one on meat products, the other on oil, that created political problems for the Biden administration. The Biden administration's reaction to that was feckless. First, they ignored it. Then when they were challenged, they said, well, these could be private hackers in Russia, as if private hackers in Russia creating political problems in the United States would not escape the notice of the FSB and the GRU. Finally, under pressure here, political criticism here, Biden began to respond to this. This became the principal subject in Geneva. Biden laid out a very tough position in Geneva. And even people like me were pleased with that, except the Geneva summit was in the middle of June. On our July 4 weekend, we faced another string of cyber attacks. So Biden's tough words produced no real positive reaction in Moscow. And there too, it took a couple of days for the Biden administration to react to these latest provocations. This continued through the fall, and I won't go into any further because I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the point I'm driving here is that the Kremlin saw a weakness, and this was part of the Biden team's effort, feckless, to establish those stable and predictable relations with a serial provocateur whose principal policy was designed to undermine critical American interests. So we come to the fall, right? And once again, the Kremlin assembles all these troops on Ukraine's border. And the Biden team reaction was very good, very fast. They began to background the press in late October about what was happening and expressing their real concerns. They send our CIA director, Bill Burns, to Moscow in like the second week of November to express our concerns and lay out some warnings. Burns is basically shut down by Putin. In other words, he doesn't get through. He's a smart guy, a friend of mine, a longtime colleague, and a former ambassador to Russia. And he comes back and reports this. This happens roughly 2 or 3 days before the Ukrainian foreign minister, Kuleba, comes to Washington. In the course of that visit, the United States goes public with the things they were putting in the press on background, which is you have this major Russian buildup. It looks like they're heading to a major escalation of their current war against Ukraine. And it's probably going to come in late January or February. They also lay out, I would say, an impressive three-part response to this. Well, I should say impressive at face value, not quite as good on closer inspection. One, major sanctions on Moscow if it happens. Two, plussing up NATO's forces in the East if it happens. Three, arms to Ukraine if it happens. Now, why do I say that's not impressive, but just okay? Because the last two, to be effective, should not have been for after Moscow invades. It should have been for right now. Meaning, you're not going to have a deterrent impact on Moscow if the weapons you sent to Ukraine only arrive after their major escalation. Ditto with the plus up of American forces in the eastern part of NATO, meaning the Baltic states, Romania, Poland, and so on. Now, why that hesitation? I think that's related again to this notion of, well, we want to kind of improve the relationship with Moscow. We want to park that relationship so we can deal with the greater problem in Beijing. Also, we see a repeat of exactly what they did in the spring. Just as they lay out these tough conditions, Jake gets on the phone again with Patrushev to begin the process that led to the virtual summit in December. So all of these things, on the one hand, suggest, again, we understood that Moscow going large into Ukraine is a geopolitical nightmare and also a political nightmare at home for Biden. On the other hand, we still have this notion that somehow we're going to reach an understanding with the bad boy in the Kremlin. And again, the bad boy in the Kremlin is drawing the conclusion, cyber contributed, the Afghanistan fiasco withdrawal contributed to it, that he could push the United States around. Okay. Never mind we. The administration received some criticism in the United States, especially from the Republicans, but also some reservations on the Democrat side too in Congress, where there's also strong support for Ukraine, that about the inadequacies of that three-partite response. So finally, literally about a month ago, maybe 4.5 weeks ago, it was a Saturday. So I think it was actually 5 weeks ago. The Biden administration decides, yes, we're going to start sending those weapons. And yes, we're going to start plussing up NATO's East. Although the political analyst and the skeptic in me says the principal reason for the decision being taken at that time was the disastrous Biden press conference, where he talked about a small incursion by Russia as something perhaps a little bit less ominous or troublesome, for which he was properly slammed. So we begin to do that. And I would say since then, US policy has been very good. With one, and I'll come back to one reservation a little bit later. The policy then is, again, we're sending weapons to Ukraine. We're putting more forces in NATO's East. Of course, we're working with our partners on this. And then, of course, despite all these things, you have that bizarre Putin press conference, addressed to the nation last Monday. And then the big invasion starts, Wednesday night, Washington time. Here, too, we have a relatively fast reaction by the administration on sanctions. Some reservations about going whole hog, in part because of the desire to consult with the allies and with the partners, EU being the partner here of the most importance. But interestingly, and Pierre and Daniela referred to this, we began to see a true change in Europe among the Europeans who in the past have been reluctant to take strong measures against Moscow as a result of this major invasion. So you had this peculiar 24-hour period, and literally like yesterday, no, today's Sunday, so Friday and Saturday, where the Europeans jump ahead of us on issues like kicking Russia out of SWIFT. And this enables the US then, the Biden administration, to go forward in the right way, because I think they were held back on moving on SWIFT before that because they were concerned especially about the French and German reaction. Also, it's worth noting that the last time a senior US official used that fatuous phrase, stable and predictable, regarding our goals towards Moscow was in early January. Tony Blinken said it. I don't think you'll hear it ever again. But it just shows you how late they held on to this E-Day fix, which was truly dangerous to the current situation. Okay. You may have seen me, although no reason why you would have been paying attention when I was not speaking. I'd be leaning forward some while Pierre and Daniela were talking. That's because I'm in a group exchange on the big events that David mentioned before I started to speak. The really big event is I think Zelensky willing to talk is important, but the big event is the Russian nuclear threat. And if you saw a picture, as I did when I was leaning forward, of Putin talking with his defense minister Shoigu and his chief military guy Gerasimov, what you note is that both Shoigu and Gerasimov look extremely uncomfortable. And if you were paying attention, and I don't even know why the Kremlin did this, it's really interesting, it's really bizarre. If you were paying attention to the Russian National Security meeting earlier in the week, where Putin's making the case for going in large into Ukraine, and you see how uncomfortable everybody else is, even as saying, yes, of course, Mr. Putin, of course, President Putin, let's do this, how uncomfortable they feel. That's because when Putin decided to go into Ukraine, he was pulling the tablecloth off the table, somehow hoping that the issues were going to remain in place. And everyone else around him understood that this was a serious, serious gamble. And if you've been paying attention to the news reports over the past 4 days, and it's hard not to, you know that the Russians are not doing very well. The Ukrainians are fighting very effectively. And this is dangerous for Putin. And also, Putin looking at the reaction, especially in Europe and especially in Germany. One thing that David did not mention, which is very important, and I woke up to this news today, is that Germans are greatly increasing defense spending, and it looks like they're crossing the magical 2% on defense spending, which the US has been pushing for a long, long time. This is extraordinary. This is extraordinary. And the Germans finally deciding that Nord Stream 2 should be kaput is extraordinary. Nord Stream 2 was a disgrace for Germany. And some of you may know I've been a very sharp critic of the Biden administration's rolling over for the Germans on this. A disgrace for the Biden administration. Because what Nord Stream 2 did was buy the Kremlin, or to buy Kremlin even more influence in Germany. Ostpolitik worked against German and Western interests. And finally, the Germans seem to be realizing it, thank God. Okay, so what happens next? Besides the report about the raising of Putin once again waiving the nuclear threat, there are also credible reports, not that this will happen, but the Russians may be ready to do some truly barbaric things in Ukraine. I suspect that virtually everyone in Russia would be appalled by that, with the exception of the guy who makes the decisions. But I just saw a report again leaning forward about something called a thermobaric, which happens to be a barbaric bomb, which sucks the oxygen out of the room, so to speak, which the Kremlin may be considering employing in Ukraine. There'd be extraordinary problems if they were to do that, but certainly a lot of Ukrainians would die were that to happen. My sense is that it's critical for the West not to be intimidated by the nuclear threat. I've been saying this a lot lately, that the Soviet Union was a much greater danger to the West than Putin's Russia. It was much more powerful. And the US and our NATO allies managed to defend critical interests twice in Berlin in 1948 and 61, and of course in Cuba in 62, when we had this danger of a nuclear exchange. Of course, the nuclear exchange is obviously every bit as dangerous to Moscow as it is to the West. And we can't be intimidated. And I suspect there are people in Russia who understand that, including very powerful people. So we need to make sure that we do all that we can. We're not talking about now having a shooting war with Russia over Ukraine, to defeat Putin in Ukraine. Because we should have no doubts, especially given his behavior the past week, that his sights go to NATO members, especially the very vulnerable Baltic states. And we need to stay the course. One last point in my 20 seconds. China, Russia is a problem. I've said for a long time that yes, China is the greater long-term threat, but given Putin's habit of risk-taking, we have to defeat the shorter-term threat in order to deal more properly with the longer-term threat. You can be sure if we let Putin have his way in Ukraine, we increase the odds that China goes after Taiwan. Thank you.